I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I have joining me, returning guest, the Executive Director of Betterin Our Backyard, Ryan Sistad. Welcome back, Ryan.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Yes, it's been a busy spring. You and I saw each other in a couple of cities, in Miami and Toronto, at the different events. I had a good time. We got a lot of work done. You seem to be busy getting a lot accomplished at those events. So before we get into too much, let's remind everybody who you are and what your organization is.
Well, thanks, Michael. Well, again, I'm Ryan Sistad. I'm the executive director of Betterin Our Backyard. I've been running the association for roughly 5 years. We're located out of Duluth, Minnesota. However, in the past couple of years, we've expanded into Michigan, Wisconsin, Idaho, and now Arizona. And our mission is to promote responsible industrial development of projects. A lot of our focus and messaging is around critical minerals, permitting reform, but we also do some work in the oil and gas sectors for a local refinery here in Superior, Wisconsin. And also we do some work regarding the issue of Line 5, which also is a Canadian issue as well for Enbridge. And we believe that responsible industrial development falls under the umbrella of large-scale industrial projects that we think can drive the local economy with good paying jobs while also still protecting our local environment.
Well said. Yeah, your organization has grown by leaps and bounds since I first met you, and it's good to see. But you guys scored, well, not necessarily you guys, but the industry itself scored a big victory in Arizona this year with a large copper mine. Let's talk about that and how that all came about and got fast tracked.
Well, for the Resolution Copper project to be a success, there has to be a federal land swap because that's where their deposit sits. And the deposit that Resolution is targeting is massive. It's if Resolution were up and running today, it would supplement 25% of U.S. copper demand based off of 2022 copper consumptions within the U.S. So it's a massive project, and it's very critical to the Department of Energy's goals. They just started the U.S.'s Department of Energy, added copper as a critical material last summer because they know that as the DOE pushes for more, renewables, whether it's wind turbines, electric vehicles, EV charging stations, or solar panels, it's going to require a lot of copper. And so Resolution is destined to play a foundational role in that. And the ruling that in which they won basically just justified that, their land swap that was previously approved in 2014 during the Obama administration is legal. And last year, the U.S. Forest Service basically put that decision at a halt for that land swap, and this Ninth Circuit Court ruling basically says no, this was legal, and it should move forward. So it's a huge win for the project, and then I would also argue that it's a huge win for the U.S. mining industry in general, because I think it sends a strong signal that there should be a clear path to permit a new mine in the U.S., especially under federal regulations.
Perfect. That's a good explanation as to what's happened there. What always, floors me to some degree and intrigues me is the process that happens in the U.S. with regards to permitting. It seems as though people apply for the permit, they get awarded the permit, and then all the opposition shows up to have the permit taken away. Am I out to lunch? Is that the way it actually works?
It happens quite a bit, and actually that a lot of it is within our federal permitting system. Obviously, there's some states like Minnesota, unfortunately being one of them, where it's tough to permit a new large scale industrial project in the state of Minnesota. But if you're going to try to get federal permits, especially within the mining industry, it's very difficult. And one great example, actually, or a case study, is Resolution Copper. So technically, Resolution has been talked about for decades in terms of the project, ever since the early 2000s, but they technically have been in the permitting process for roughly over a decade. And because they're on federal land, they have to go through NEPA. To put in perspective, Canada and Australia, from my understanding, and I know, Michael, we've gone back and forth on this, but the average timeline to permit a new mine is 3 to 5 years. And in the US, they say it's 7 to 10 years. I would argue that it's longer. But a great case study is that Arizona's mining industry, or Arizona's regulations, is much more friendly to permitting a new mine. So just 60 miles, I would say, southwest of Resolution, there's a company called, or there's a project called the Cactus Mine, and it only requires state permits and private. It's only on state and private land, and that project got permitted within 3 years. And it's just because it's not on federal land. It's within the same county as Resolution Copper. It has the same project, it has a very similar project plan. However, there's just one key difference. Resolution Copper's deposit happens to be on federal land, where Cactus is just, on state and private land. So you look at some of these states, it varies by state. You look at Michigan, Michigan's Eagle Mine, which didn't have to go through the federal permitting process. They got permitted within 7 years. And then you look to their neighbors, or somewhat neighbors, in Minnesota, where you have, PolyMet's NorthMet project, now known as New Range Copper Nickel's NorthMet project. They've been in the permitting process for over 18 years, and most of their permitting requires state permits, but they also have to go through NEPA as well. So if you're trying to get through the federal permitting process in the U.S. currently, until there's real permitting reform or comprehensive permitting reform, it's a challenging route to permit a new mine in the U.S.
So if you're an investor, you want to find opportunities that are sitting on private or state-held land rather than federal land. Is that a correct assumption?
I'm not an expert on investments, and I'm not going to give any advice, I guess, on that. But I mean, if I were on my own, or if, let's say, if I were to try to permit a project, or let's say if I was a CEO of a mining company, I definitely would be extremely biased to projects that are just on state lands, in states that have friendly mining jurisdictions. But then we've also seen some other good things too on a federal level, especially by this administration. The current administration has done some things that have been very negative, I would argue, to the mining industry, but they've also done some good positive things. So you look at South 32's proposed Hermosa mine. They're targeting manganese. Right now, the U.S. doesn't have any domestic production of manganese, and last year the administration added the Hermosa project to a Fast 41 program. And the Fast 41 program is a federal program. It was designed to streamline large-scale infrastructure projects, and the Hermosa mine is the first to be added to Fast 41 into that program. And I would argue, the goal is to get that project permitted within a couple of years, because they're part of the Fast 41 program. And I would argue that once South 32 and that Hermosa team prove that you can permit a mine in a reasonable timeline while still, responsibly mining, still protecting your local environment, while still providing good paying jobs, then that logic should be applied to all projects across the country that require federal permitting, that all have a good plan, that are all willing to meet or exceed the environmental and labor standards that are put ahead of them. And so personally, I'm really cheering for South 32. I'm looking forward to that project being a success, because at that point, there is no reason why Congress can't pass good, comprehensive permitting reform for all large-scale industrial projects, not just in mining.
This is kind of a two-part question. What's the extra steps that a mining company has to go through if they need a national permit versus just the regular state permit? In most cases, I guess it would vary from state to state. Yeah. And then the second part of the question would be then, how does this Fast 41 process speed up that process? Does it eliminate steps, or just does it make it go quicker?
Well, those are great questions. And I'm not a permitting expert by any means, but my understanding that is, if you have to go through NEPA and also through state permitting, those are two different agencies and two different programs that you have to go through permitting. So it adds to your overhead. If you're going through permitting and you have to get both state and federal permits. And then to answer your second question with Fast 41, the way that I understand it, the way that I've read up on it, is that it forces the agencies to coordinate with each other and to work with each other to make sure, and then it allows companies to apply for a permit or for multiple permits at once, rather than going, looking for approval for one permit at a time. So that's where it's, from my understanding of Fast 41, that's where it's streamlined. More coordination, and then it allows more flexibility for the mining companies to submit all their permits all at once, so that as they're getting their air permit approved and and their water permit approved, for example, they're all happening around the same timeline, rather than one's coming in a couple years from now. That's the way I understand it anyway.
Okay, so it's designed to streamline the process. So Ryan, then how much overlap is there between the state and the federal permits? Are they talking to each other a lot, or is they kind of you get do the thing for the state and then you have to do it again for the feds?
From my understanding, not really. There isn't. I don't. I'm uncertain of this, but I believe that the agencies aren't required to talk to each other between state and federal, and that's yeah. I would argue that's part of the issue because a lot of the federal regulations are the same as the state regulations for similar permits. But I know, like like in Minnesota, for example, it's every state is different in terms of their jurisdiction. Like I was reading a stat somewhere that on average in Minnesota, it takes 6.5 times longer to get an air permit for any kind of project than it does in any other state. So as much as the permitting process is slow on the federal level, there's some states that are more efficient than others, and there's some states that are just as inefficient as the federal permitting process, or even more inefficient. So, but in terms of them coordinating with each other, from my understanding, they're not required to do so between state
Okay.
and federal agencies.
So yeah, things are very similar here in Canada. The federal government has its process, but most of the permitting gets handed down to the provinces to deal with. And some provinces, they're easier to deal with than others. Like if you're in Quebec, you can get permitted fairly quickly. Ontario's not too bad. BC tends to lag along, but if you're in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, permitting can be really quite the chore, and then the other provinces are kind of somewhere in between. But unlike you guys, we don't really have a permitting champion at a federal government level to help streamline this and make things go smoother. But you guys do with Senator Manchin from the wonderful state of Virginia, which is a big mining jurisdiction in your country. Can you tell me what Senator Manchin's all up to and how that's going to help the process?
Well, between introducing various bills over the last couple of years and just his public advocacy for it, I don't think there's any bigger champion for permitting reform on a federal level than Senator Manchin, and he's been doing a very good job of gaining bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle in terms of permitting reform. And one of the things that he always likes to bring up, and which I agree with him on, is the Inflation Reduction Act, and because the Inflation Reduction Act, it's done a lot of good things over the past couple of years in bringing in domestic investment for the manufacturing of electric vehicles and bringing manufacturing jobs here to the U.S. But one thing it failed to do is really increase domestic production of the raw materials needed for the very technologies that we're manufacturing here in the U.S. And so within the Inflation Reduction Act, it includes incentives for U.S. mining companies to extract EV battery minerals, whether that's nickel, cobalt. And unfortunately, though, the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't address the permitting reform that is needed to make sure that U.S.-based projects that are targeting nickel or targeting cobalt or targeting lithium are a success in a timely fashion. And those incentives also encompass, for example, like if I'm a EV automaker and I want to source my nickel from Canada or Australia, Canada and Australia are looped in on that. However, unfortunately, on average, as I was saying earlier, it takes 3 to 5 years to permit a new mine in Canada and Australia, where in the US it takes over 10 years. So what Senator Manchin is basically saying that until we have real permitting reform for these large scale industrial projects, whether that's a new mine or even a new pipeline, we're going to have to be getting our raw materials from our allies in Canada and Australia, which is fine, but we're going to be sending more of our IRA dollars to other countries, essentially, rather than keeping that money here at home to make sure that projects are a success here. So he's been very consistent in terms of bringing in permitting reform. One example being like Talon Metals here in Minnesota, or like New Range Copper Nickel's NorthMet project, or even Twin Metals Minnesota's proposed copper, nickel, and cobalt mine. Essentially, what he's saying is that these projects should feel the benefits of incentivizing for raw materials needed for battery metals. So he's been pushing for permitting reform and comprehensive permitting reform, where basically it streamlines the process without circumventing environmental safeguards, where a new project like New Range Copper Nickel's NorthMet project can actually be permitted in 3 to 5 years while still protecting our local environment, while still meeting very high environmental regulations. And so Mancin's been good on that, and he's been very good in gaining bipartisan support because historically it's been very much a Republican talking point, and Mancin has done a good job in bringing more colleagues from his side of the aisle to warm up to permitting reform. And ironically, that's because we're seeing large scale clean energy projects that it's taking them a while to get their permits. So we're seeing both. So now we're seeing some synergies between one of those rare instances where you're seeing synergies on both sides of the aisle kind of come together and talk about permitting reform. It's becoming a bipartisan issue, and I think Senator Mancin has played a big role in making it a bipartisan issue.
Yeah, it's good when you can get those magic bullet issues where the differences between the two sides of the aisle aren't that great, and you can actually get something accomplished. And this sounds like this is one of those situations. Now, Senator Mancin is planning to retire and leave Congress at the end of this session. Is his reforms likely to get completed before he goes?
I sure hope so, and I think if there's anyone that can do it in the Senate, not that I have a relationship with every senator in the Senate, but just seeing his passion for this topic, and I think if there's a guy to do it, it's him.
Well, that's good news indeed. But in the meantime, we've had a couple of wins, so we should mark those up on the board and take some victories when we get them, because they do tend to be few and far between sometimes.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. It's good to celebrate the wins, and then also too, I was talking to a colleague last week. Talking. We got in a conversation, and the topic was, we were talking about how, there's been a lot of negatives that have happened over the past couple of years. And he kind of just mentioned to me, he reminded me, even though there's been some negatives that have happened over the past couple of years, the best thing to do is to look forward and think positively. And that's what I'm going to choose to do with the U.S. mining industry and proposed projects in the U.S. is just to think forward, look forward and think ahead and be positive about the future, because I do think the future is bright for the U.S. mining industry in general and for proposed projects. It may not be here yet, but I believe it's coming, and that starts with permitting reform.
Yeah, and there seems to be momentum to get there. So these are all good things. If people want to follow you and your organization, what's the best way for them to do so?
Well, you can visit our website at www.betterinoubackyard.com. However, we're extremely active on our LinkedIn and Facebook and X pages. So if you want to kind of stay up to date with us, I would encourage you to follow our pages. And then if you want any more in-depth information on what we're doing, visit our website.
Wonderful. I've enjoyed having you on the show, and I look forward to having you on again in the very near future with more wins to put up in that victory column.
That sounds great, Michael. I appreciate it.
Thanks for your time, Ryan.
Thank you, sir.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.